There is a certain inevitability unfolding inside the cemetery Thomas Martin constructed in his backyard, feeling as though each of the events he is experiencing has been weighed, measured, and memorialized in a cosmic ledger that has been stored in a luggage locker located just outside platform number 1, at a place where ordinary men and women leave for destinations unknown. That place, good friends, is a train depot known as the Conflation Station. Thomas Martin had always believed in precision. It governed his work, his thoughts, and increasingly his understanding of the boundary between life and death. When his recent acquaintance, Emily Westbrook, a spiritual medium, now his co-conspirator, handed him a slip of paper with 5 names of deceased persons her clients were trying to contact, he received them not as stories of grief, but as variables, necessary additions to an experiment that had already begun to unmake the rules it sought to define. Each name on her list came attached to a tragedy. A wife who had withered slowly beneath the indifferent mathematics of cancer. A son who had slipped quietly into chemical oblivion before his 20th birthday, overdosing on fentanyl. A young child whose brief existence had been spent negotiating with leukemia, an illness that never intended to let her win. A firefighter who had run toward fire to save lives only to be consumed by it. And a father, Emily's father, who died not in violence or illness, but of natural causes associated with old age in the stillness of his own bed. He worked through archives, obituaries, hospital records, municipal registries. He confirmed spellings, he verified dates, he cross-referenced inconsistencies. Ultimately, each of the 5 lives was reduced to its most essential data: a name, a date of death, an inflexible endpoint. Because for Martin, the endpoint was now an experiment, and the experiment demanded complete accuracy. Martin ordered the 5 new headstones, one for each name on Emily's list. When he placed the order, he was meticulous in his instructions. The 5 new headstones were to be identical to the original 37 in his first order. Same dimensions, same granite, same font, same spacing between each letter and number. No variations in the experimental design that might contaminate the results. The engraver did not ask questions. People rarely do when confronted with Martin's particular brand of certainty. 1 month later, the stones were delivered. Emily Westbrook arrived 15 minutes before the appointed time. She stood at the edge of the yard, her hands folded tightly as though they were bracing against something unseen. For her, the yard was a quiet congregation of names that belonged together, arranged with a logic only Martin understood. Headstones for his family members were placed there over a year ago, and now a group of strangers was about to join them. Martin explained his plan to Emily in clinical terms. Distribution would be even, no clustering, no distinction between familial and non-familial dead. Control variables, he said. Emily did not respond. She observed. When the delivery truck arrived, the moment felt less like a delivery and more like an intrusion. The men who unloaded the stones worked quickly, avoiding eye contact with Martin, Emily, and the field of dug-up graves beneath their feet. Martin supervised placement with a laser focus. 1 stone near the far fence, 1 beside his aunt, 1 between 2 cousins, 1 near the back where the ground dipped slightly, and 1, Emily's father's, placed near the center, interwoven, indistinguishable, complete. When it was finished, the yard no longer belonged to any single family. It had become something else, a mosaic of loss assembled without regard for blood or family history. Neither Martin nor Emily spoke of what might happen next. There were no hypotheses voiced aloud, only silence. At last Martin turned to her and said, "Time will tell." It was not reassurance, it was procedure. Emily left soon thereafter, her steps measured as though she feared disturbing whatever unseen balance had been created. Martin watched her go, then returned to the house, descending into the morgue beneath it. All of the coffins stored there remained sealed. For the first time, Martin chose not to open any of them. It was not fear, it was control. Too many variables had already been introduced which could invalidate the test results. He sat at his desk reviewing notes that no longer seemed sufficient to explain what was about to unfold. The air in the room felt heavier than usual, though no observable change could be detected. Martin's cell phone vibrated. There, a single text message appeared from the same untraceable number, the same number that had spoken once before. The message read, "Thomas, why have you invaded our privacy?" Martin did not react immediately. He read the message again, then a third time, parsing each word with the same care he had applied to death certificates and engravings. "Our," it read, not singular, but plural. Was it his grandfather again, or someone or something else claiming to be him? Martin considered the possibilities. A prank? The engraver? Perhaps Emily? Perhaps an elaborate deception? He responded to the text message. "Who is this?" The reply came back instantly. An auto reply. Message undeliverable. He tried again. The same result. Undeliverable. That was when the realization began to settle into him, not as a shock, but as a correction. Communication by and between the dead and the living was not reciprocal. It never had been. The dead never answered. They never spoke. And the living tried to listen. As Emily said when she and Martin first met, no one has ever communicated with the deceased. Martin now began to grasp the problem with Emily's statement. While the dead may reach out to the living, they did not give the living an opportunity to respond. And now it is time for us to take a brief respite and listen to an intermezzo conceived by world-renowned composer E. Dudek, after which the saga of Thomas Martin will resume. We continue. Martin received another text message 10 minutes later. "I have heard from the family, and they are unhappy." Martin stared down at his cell phone. Heard from the family? The implication was unmistakable. The dead were not isolated. They were not silent. They were social, connected, aware, a network of consciousness existing beyond a boundary Martin had once believed was absolute. He leaned back in his chair, his thoughts accelerating. If the dead could communicate with each other, then death was not an end. It was a transition, a relocation, a continuation. The implications were staggering, not just philosophically, but scientifically. What if death was not the cessation of existence, but the migration of existence by subatomic means? What if the experiment was not creating communication, but disrupting something that already existed? The headstones, the names, the dates, markers of finality. What if finality was based on man's limited biological capacity to perceive forces and entities beyond his five senses? Or to the contrary, was it purely based on society's acceptance of the mythology called religion? The next morning, Martin drove up the coast to a cemetery in Harborview, the cemetery where his grandparents were buried. The cemetery was small and unchanged from his childhood. The small, narrow paths, the same aging trees, the same quiet insistence of permanence. He parked and walked directly to his grandparents' graves. They stood side by side, just as they always had, unmoved. At first glance, the grave sites appeared as they always did. Upon closer inspection, he noticed something different. While the stones were intact and his grandparents' names were intact, the dates his grandparents died were gone, not faded, not obscured, removed. Where the numbers had once defined the boundaries of their lives, there was now only smooth, uninterrupted stone, as though time itself had been erased. Martin stepped closer, examining the surface. There were no tool marks, no signs of vandalism, no indication that human hands had altered the stone. The dates had not been removed, they had ceased to exist. He felt something then. It was not fear, not confusion, but displacement. A sense that the world he occupied was no longer aligned with the rules he had always trusted. He turned. The cemetery was empty, but not silent. There was a presence, not visible, not audible, but undeniable. A density in the air as though the space itself had become occupied in a way that defied observation. Martin looked back at the stones. No dates, no endings, only names, personal identifiers without conclusion. He thought again about the words in the text message he received from his grandfather the day before. Our privacy, the family, unhappy. He thought of the headstones in his yard, 42 markers, each declaring a finality that might not, in reality, even exist or ever existed. Each one a statement, a claim, a trespass. Martin had believed he was studying death, but now, standing in that cemetery, he began to understand. He had not been studying the dead. He had been interfering with them in the course of their continued existence. In a quiet corner of a quiet town, a man, Thomas Martin, had sought to impose order on the unknowable. He spent his life's work gathering names, recording dates, placing stones, and in doing so, he had committed an act not of science, but of intrusion. Because death, as Martin was beginning to understand, was not a boundary to be crossed, nor a system to be mapped. It was a domain, occupied, aware, and perhaps most interesting of all, serving to protect its own. For Martin, somewhere beyond the reach of sight and sound, conversations continued, not with the living, but about them. And in that unseen discourse, one name had begun to circulate with increasing frequency. His name, Thomas Martin, a man who had mistaken silence for absence. The man who documented finality on genealogical charts and carved permanence into stone, discovered that permanence could be erased. And as he stood before two headstones that no longer acknowledged the end of life, one question lingered, not just in his mind, but in the space around him. Not spoken, but understood. If the dead could remove their own endings, what else could they change? We shall learn more on our next trip, leaving platform number 1, bound for the Conflation Station.